I want to welcome, I'd like to welcome everybody tonight. I'm sure that once we get quiet, we'll be able to hear from Secretary Moniz. So first of all, welcome. My name is Steve Agee. I'm the Dean of the Moniz School of Business at Oklahoma City University. For those of you who are from out of town or out of state, welcome to Oklahoma City and welcome to the state of Oklahoma. It's really an honor and pleasure for me to welcome you to the 2017 Fall Energy Speaker Series. This speaker series was started in 2010, really with the wonderful support of the Carl and June Martin Family Foundation. And one of the trustees is here with us this evening, and I think, Joe, you've been at every one of our Energy Speaker Series, so would you please welcome with me Joe and his wife Jan from, they actually flew in from Chicago. Joe Womack and his wife Jan flew in from Chicago today? Last week, okay, well they've been here a little bit longer. Rick Goranson, Eddie DeHavrila is also, or Eddie Havrila is also some of the trustees, so we're missing them tonight, but please convey our thanks to them. I also want to thank the Moniz School of Business staff, Trudy Cunningham, Pam Meltner here tonight at the registration desk, so thanks for being here to take registrations. I also see a few dignitaries in the crowd I'd like to recognize. I see that Oklahoma Corporation Commissioner Bob Anthony is, where's Commissioner Anthony? And we have two former energy secretaries in the crowd. One I actually had dinner with last night. So Mike Ming and his wife Diane Ming is here tonight at the head table. And I also saw Bobby Wagner. Where's Bobby? Bobby's a former energy secretary. Right over here. Bobby's claim to fame is he's married to Meredith Wagner, who's the director of our energy programs at Oklahoma City University. So good job, Bobby. So there's one piece of housekeeping that I need to take care of, and that relates to the fact that per agreement, Secretary Moniz's comments this evening are to be considered off the record. Okay, so we want him to be very candid, very honest with it, and he was this morning. He came out to the university and spoke to our students. How many of the Moniz School of Business students or alumni are here tonight? Would you raise your hand? So this, kind of like the Economic Club of Oklahoma, this is off the record. His comments are to be considered, if you're among the press, off the record. He's already conducted several interviews with the press and with both the print media and the television media. So we'd like his comments to be open, candid, forthright on all the views of energy, geopolitical topics related to global energy matters. So that's the deal. At the first of these Energy Speakers series in 2010, I stated that over the next several decades, we're likely to see profound changes in energy production and use both in the United States and around the world. These changes will greatly impact producers and consumers of energy and could fundamentally alter the role that governments play in energy policy. There are several factors driving these changes, including economic and political implications stemming from historically volatile energy prices, as well as geopolitical issues related to energy security. Going forward, however, the critical factor is likely to be the growing concern that the current energy model is contributing to significant environmental degradation, which, if unchecked, could lead to further major climate and environmental changes around the world. Although there's widespread agreement that fundamental changes in energy production and use and in energy policy are needed, there is considerable disagreement about the form that these changes should take, the time frame over which they can or should occur, and government's role in mandating or facilitating these changes. Behind these differing views are a range of complex economic, technological, and political issues that make it difficult both to chart the way forward and to identify feasible strategies to implement needed changes. And realistically, there are also significant factors slowing or resisting change, including entrenched political and economic interests, as well as existing energy infrastructures, business models, and consumer lifestyles that may inhibit changes. Despite these challenges, however, there is likely to be substantial agreement that a new energy model is needed. Such a model would have three main goals: better environmental outcomes, stable energy prices, a policy framework for energy producers and energy consumers, and enhanced energy security with a reduction in the role that geopolitical factors play in shaping energy policy. To accomplish these goals, a new model will almost certainly be developed around three fundamental objectives: lowering the amounts of carbon and other toxic environmental emissions, reducing overall energy consumption through increased efficiencies in production and consumption, and increased use of renewable energy resources. The June Martin Energy Management Speaker Series fosters dialogue and debate on these important issues by bringing distinguished energy experts and visionary speakers to Oklahoma City and to Oklahoma City University. These issues are of particular relevance to Oklahoma because of the significant role that Oklahoma has played in the development of the energy industry historically, and because of the emerging new energy model will likely have major implications for the role that Oklahoma may play in the future of energy. Tonight, it's my pleasure to introduce Dr. Ernest J. Moniz as our guest speaker. Dr. Moniz served as the 13th United States Energy Secretary from 2013 to 2017. As Secretary, he advanced energy technology innovation, nuclear security and strategic stability, cutting-edge capabilities for the American scientific community, and environmental stewardship. He strengthened the Department of Energy, strategic partnership with its 17 national laboratories, and the Department of Defense, and the broader national security establishment. Dr. Moniz served on the Massachusetts Institute Technology faculty from 1973 until becoming Secretary of Energy in 2013, and is now the Cecil and Ida Green Professor of Physics and Engineering Systems Emeritus and Special Advisor to the MIT President. Dr. Moniz received a Bachelor of Science degree, summa cum laude, in physics from Boston College, a doctorate in theoretical physics from Stanford University, and 9 honorary doctorates, including 3 from European universities. Secretary Moniz, as you know, I teach a graduate energy class at the Minor School of Business, and my current cohort of students, many of whom are present tonight and you spoke to this morning, take their final exam tomorrow night. In preparation for this introduction, I found citations for many of your publications, and I recommend to my students, in preparation for their final tomorrow night, they might want to take a look at 2 of your publications. One entitled Coupled Channel Effects on Heavy Ion Subbarrier Fusion with a Doorway Expansion Method, and the other entitled Radiation Reaction in Non-Relativistic Quantum Electrodynamics. There was a third article, Nuclear Fermi Momenta from Quasi-Elastic Electron Scattering, but I think I'll save that for the next cohort. So will you please join me in giving a very warm Oklahoma City reception to Dr. Ernest Moniz, former U.S. Energy Secretary.
Well, thank you, Steve. That was pretty good research. But I want to assure you that those papers were all in the younger part of my career. The, right now it's more things like the future of coal, and the future of natural gas, et cetera, which I'll come to. But let me say, it's really a pleasure to be back here. I was, I think, last year in Oklahoma City in 2011 to help launch the governor's energy policy program. Mike Ming, I think, was then the Secretary of Energy, and I still have my wonderful Oklahoma bison in my office. Although I could tell you how the curtain cleaners happened to knock it off and they had to repair it. But anyway, that's a long story. But thanks to Steve again, and first of all, this morning was great fun with the students, and we had time for, I don't know, half an hour of questions or something like that, and that was fun. And the last challenge to them, something that Steve says really is already being done, but was that in this time and prospect of tremendous change in the energy business across the board, that those are the students who've got to think innovatively about new business models, because that's really going to be a great opportunity, but also clearly very, very important, I think, to evolve the area. I also want to say a couple words more about Mike Ming. Mike and I go back to about 2002, when we formed a lonely pair of a natural gas subgroup of a, let's say, environmentally leaning group looking at energy policy, and that led to many continuing interactions. Actually, next to him is Melanie Kenderdine, who I've been working with since my first go-round to the Department of Energy in the late 90s. And when I introduced them, then she got Mike Ming to be the CEO of RIPSI, which is this organization, research organization, looking at unconventional, particularly unconventional deep water oil and gas production, and that kind of led to a major effort on Mike's part. But then, in this very brief history, to say that I think we did a very influential report from 2008 to 2011. It was at MIT. It was called The Future of Natural Gas. And Mike was on our advisory board. Melanie was at MIT working very deeply in it. And by the way, Oklahoma City roots in terms of Chesapeake as a major funder of this study. And I think that we were there. Timing is everything. We were there at the right time, captured the kind of the techno-economics of the emerging unconventional gas shale plays, and I think that report really had a big impact, particularly in the policy community in Washington, in alerting them to what was happening and seeing how important it was for our country's economy and environment. So anyway, just to say that there's kind of a network here that's gone back for a while, and it's really great to be back. So Steve talked about some of the things that I should talk about, although you also told me I should talk about Iran at some point. But what I'll do is I'll not do that, but I'm happy to answer, just to say I'm happy to answer questions on the nuclear security side of what I do as well. But let me say that tonight I'll offer some remarks on energy security, global warming, and implications for the evolution of our energy system. Actually, even though I won't talk about the nuclear security in my remarks here, but I will just say one thing. Because obviously, unfortunately, in these last months, the issue of things like nuclear weapons are back in the press, North Korea and the like. And just as an observation, if you go back 25 years to 1992, the issues of nuclear weapons, nuclear security, and the issues of the emerging concerns around global warming were both on the table, and it seemed that both were major topics around which we were getting our arms. The 1992, the Soviet Union had obviously disintegrated peacefully. unknown to most people, in 1992, the United States entered into an agreement with the Soviet Union, with Russia, to take 500 tons of nuclear weapons material and put it as fuel into American nuclear reactors. 10% of this country's electricity for 20 years came from Russian weapons material. So we thought we were kind of getting around this problem. Of course, now what we have is a terrible relationship with Russia, and frankly, the increased risk, in my view, of miscalculation, whether it's there or North Korea. But anyway, I won't go to that. I'll just say that, again, 1992 looked like a good direction. Now a little bit more dangerous, frankly. 1992 was also the year in Rio that the world came together and adopted the UN Framework Convention on Climate Change. This is often a forgotten event. The reality is that in 1992, not only did President George H.W. Bush sign that, but the Senate ratified that agreement in 1992. And that ratification, what I'll just quote, says that the commitment is to stabilize greenhouse gas concentrations in the atmosphere at a level that would prevent dangerous anthropogenic interference with the climate system. Now, so that's the commitment that's been there on the books for 25 years. Clearly, there's a lot of definition. What is dangerous, anthropogenic, et cetera. And that's what Steve alluded to, in the sense that the program is now to be defined in terms of what do we do to balance our various interests and to address these questions of anthropogenic interference. Ultimately, the arbiter of that definition has to be science. And of course, an enormous science effort has been put into this. But what I want to emphasize is not just the science effort of these 25 years. Of course, it was going on before that. But I think what will probably surprise many people is that a pretty reasonable approximation to our current understanding of the temperature rise associated with doubling carbon dioxide concentrations in the atmosphere was calculated in the 1890s, not the 1990s, the 1890s. This is not complicated science. It is not new science. So fundamentally, where I am, and tonight we'll come and talk about some of the steps and some of the questions, et cetera, but fundamentally, this is not complicated science in terms of the fact, well, first of all, the data of a warming globe, the fact that greenhouse gases in the atmosphere drive this, and the fact that we can simply measure how much greenhouse gas we're putting in the atmosphere and understand this all fits together. So my view is, look, I'm an all-of-the-above energy guy. In the context of addressing the very hard-nosed realities of the kinds of temperature rise that we are seeing, that we will continue to see, and now the question is, how do we address that, and what are the implications for the energy system? Just as I said earlier in 1992, this is all the prologue, the setup for what I want to talk about. In 1992, as I said, with the nuclear security issues, 1992, we had that framework convention ratified by the United States Senate. It seemed that we were on kind of a course to figure out how we were going to address these issues. Now, earlier this year, as I'm sure you all know, and on June the 1st, the President announced the intention to start withdrawing from the Paris Accord, which, by the way, satisfied not only the 1992 statement, but also the 1997 Senate unanimous statement of developing countries playing a role. The President's announcement, which will not take effect if it is carried out until November the 4th, 2020, the day after the next presidential election, what is the main thing I want to emphasize is I believe, and I'll be discussing this, I believe it is now, as with the nuclear case in a certain sense, cast uncertainty that affects businesses in a major way. Again, I'll come back to discuss that, but I think that's a major part of the story. I want to emphasize that at Paris there was the agreement of essentially every country in the world to take some steps towards greenhouse gas emission reduction, typically in the 2025-2030 timeframe. But there was a second piece that I want to put on the table for, again, framing our discussion. On the very first day of the Paris meeting, when the national leaders were present, President Obama and 19 others on stage announced something called Mission Innovation. And Mission Innovation was a commitment by those 20 countries to double clean energy R&D, double the innovation budget over a 5-year ramp-up period. What I think is important, again, I'm not focusing on the numbers, whether it's doubling here or whether it's the Paris 27%. The important thing from my perspective is this made it clear in the international context that technology innovation is core to addressing the greenhouse gas global warming challenge. Everybody came forward and said, we've got to make these kinds of investments to go there. And the leaders, were accompanied on the stage by Bill Gates. Bill Gates was there, not in his Microsoft role, not in his Gates Foundation role, but he was there as a rich person to represent 27 other rich people from 10 countries who said, yeah, and governments, you make that investment in innovation, and we're ready to put in serious capital, serious patience to see that innovation bear fruit and go to the marketplace. So innovation was critical, and again, a major part of my remarks will be the theme about what we can do to advance this innovation agenda. Now, I think I do have to say a little bit more about the warming and the impacts, and regrettably, I think in a certain sense, we need to go and just look at the recent hurricanes that hit Houston and Florida, and of course now the Caribbean with Maria. What I want to emphasize is there are tremendous advances in the science, understanding the probability that that the frequency and intensity are influenced by warming. But what I want to emphasize is a very simple point again. The seas are higher. The seas are warmer. The atmosphere is warmer and holds more water. 7% more water per degree centigrade warming, a number. And so, putting aside what drives the hurricane, the impacts are amplified. And I could go back to Sandy as well, on the East Coast 10 years ago. The storm surges, et cetera, are amplified by this. And if you're questioning the connection between something like sea level rise and warming, you don't have a very good case, because roughly half of the sea level rise is nothing more than thermal expansion of the water, and the rest comes from ice melting off of land. So there's no doubt that we are seeing these effects. They have material impacts, and of course they call on us for adapting. And by the way, in the energy business, of course, especially the Houston hurricane, we have to remember the incredible role that the Gulf of Mexico plays, not just in the United States, but in the global trade in energy, and of course Oklahoma is helping supply some of that. In fact, just to say, I mean, with Oklahoma third in the country in natural gas production after Texas and Pennsylvania. And Pennsylvania is an upstart in this, I mean, relatively speaking, in the last years in the Marcellus. But also, and I have the inside story going from number 3 to number 2 in wind soon, and number 5 in oil production. So you know, these have big impacts in terms of the energy business, as well as on people, and obviously we've seen the incredible destruction that those hurricanes in all those places have played. So we can adapt, but let me make it, also let me emphasize, it's expensive. Last year I visited one utility in Florida, Florida Power and Light, and they survived Hurricane Matthew extremely well last year. Irma was a little bit too much. They're kind of overwhelmed by that. That one utility in one piece of Florida has spent $4 billion hardening poles, preventing flooding of substations. Not exactly very fancy stuff. If we start multiplying this, not only for hurricanes and coastal, but fires, forestry problems, droughts problems, adaptation is very, very expensive. We have to do it. So the question is going to be, what is that balance going to be between mitigating and adapting to these changes? That is the reality. But I'm optimistic that we can in fact do that. So before I turn to the energy security, let me just say, and let me elaborate on something I indicated earlier. When the President announced the intent to withdraw from the Paris Agreement, the reaction was incredibly interesting. Mayors, governors from many, many states came out and said that, well, we're going to kind of stay the course. But even more interesting to me was the 1,400 business people who came out and said we're going to stay the course. And so this goes back to that theme I said earlier of certainty. I think these business leaders, it's pretty clear. What they're saying is they see the warming, they see that we are going to a lower carbon economy. They have to make decisions that are decadal or multi-decadal in time scale, can involve enormous capital allocations. And so they're saying is, look, we may have a few bumps in the road, but that's fundamentally the framework in which we are going to continue to make our business decisions. And it's a reminder that a decade ago, many of the large oil companies were already using a price of carbon in their internal capital allocation decisions. So again, my theme is that this is, I think, extremely clear where we're going. Exactly the trajectory is not clear. And let's, in fact, talk, as I will now turn, let's talk about the innovation we need in technology, in policy, in business models to manage this transition to our benefit, to the benefit of our fellow citizens, to the benefit of our companies in going forward. So that's kind of the gestalt of really what I want to talk about. So let me be a bit more specific. First about energy security. And the first question about energy security is, what is it? And what I want to say, it's not just about oil. Oil remains very important in energy security discussions, but it's not the only issue. And in fact, in 2014, Russia's incursion into Ukraine is what focused the mind on relooking at what energy security is all about. And that was fundamentally about natural gas and Europe's overdependence on Russian natural gas. So the G7, together with the EU, got together and kind of defined a new set of principles around energy security. Principle 0 is energy security should not be thought of as a purely national issue as opposed to a collective responsibility. And just to make that very clear, the energy insecurity of our European allies affects our geopolitics if they do not have freedom of action. So even if we feel that our energy security, in any traditional sense at least, is very solid, and it is, it doesn't make us energy secure in terms of all of our global responsibilities. So that was number one. So we really need to come together on this. Then we defined a set of principles. The first one was maybe surprising. I don't know. The first principle put forward in 2014 for kind of energy security was flexible, transparent, competitive markets. Because in dislocations, the markets can do a lot of reallocation of resources to address energy security concerns. Now, I'll just make, as an aside, of course, I've already mentioned natural gas a few times. These are all natural gas people down here. We are seeing in the natural gas arena, even since 2014, an incredible change in the global dynamic. Ironically, not so much in Europe, but elsewhere. And so the development of the LNG markets, of course, we, the United States, started LNG exports again, I don't mean Alaska, again, a couple of years ago. And we will have additional exports, as you know, soon. When I was secretary, I'm going to, I don't know, maybe complain to some of you in here, I don't know, but we'll see. But I would say when I was secretary, we approved the export of 15 billion cubic feet per day to non-free trade agreement countries. And when there was often statements made, especially in Congress, well-informed statements, about we have to speed up the LNG export procedures. It was sometimes painful to explain that I did not have a single application on my desk not acted upon. Not one. The reason is that the companies have to get an environmental impact statement approved by FERC. And until they invest the substantial resources needed to get that approval, there is no serious possibility of a national interest determination. So what I want to say is, any idea that we in that administration, or certainly the current administration, have done anything but expedite those applications, it's just not right. And we approved an LNG export application in one case, the record, 2 hours after we got it from FERC. So I think there's a lot of support for this. There clearly are some who are concerned, both in the environmental side and also on the company side. We know that some of the users of natural gas liquids, et cetera, have been raising caution. But the fact is, I believe that there is ultimately a strong support across the government for seeing this critical resource produced, used, and exported. And in fact, in the United States, this is an aside from my principles, but in the United States, some estimates, the low estimates are 120 billion, the high estimates are around 200 billion, as the amount of investment made in new manufacturing capacity in this country because of shale gas. This is a huge economic deal, and I might say that some of this investment, like ethane crackers, are in places like or very next to Appalachia. But you don't hear that in the context of what's happening in the job scene. So anyway, so this is a critically important development. It's aligned with that first principle, also internationally, of developing these transparent markets. Secondly, diversification of fuel sources, routes, and indigenous production, and that's more in line with the traditional oil discussion. But I want to emphasize, it wasn't simple to add indigenous production. Some members of the G7 were less enthusiastic than others for that, but that's an important principle. Third, transition to a low-carbon economy. Most of the energy security issues are, let's face it, are around fossil fuels, oil and natural gas in particular, and so that's part and parcel of the energy security framework. And there were others I won't go into in all detail in terms of demand response and innovation. Two I will discuss a little bit more. Infrastructure resilience is another part of energy security, and we have a long way to go in the United States to really get the kind of resilience that we need. But the seventh and last principle, was emergency response systems, reserves, and fuel switching. And here I want to comment a little bit on that in the context of the Petroleum Reserve. So in the 1970s, when the Petroleum Reserve was put in place, as people in this room know, the oil markets looked nothing like today's oil markets. And yet we remain, not only in this issue, but in many issues, mired in ideas of the 1970s. Frankly, the structure of the Department of Energy is mired in the 1970s, but that's a separate issue that we could come to. And we need to have a more modern way of looking at this. And this gets to the question, we were discussing it over by the wine earlier, about so-called energy independence. And I do not believe that we will have, or frankly even wish for, energy independence in a meaningful way. That is because we are and will be, maybe increasingly will be, as we export oil products, import the same, export gas, etc. We are linked to the global market and the global prices. It's the price exposure that ultimately is the issue around energy security. And in that context, I'm afraid that the discussions around the Petroleum Reserve, sometimes called the piggy bank of the last few years, have not been very, very well informed. Because this is not, I want to make it very clear, this has got nothing to do with trying to set prices. It's a question of being able to smooth out what can be disruptive volatility there. And this has been used for a long time. For example, when we were in the Clinton administration in 2000, we exercised our authority, as did Secretary Perry just recently, to swap oil out of the Petroleum Reserve to help a refinery that couldn't get supply by water because of an accident, for example. So I want to emphasize the Petroleum Reserve is an important part of energy security. It remains an important part of energy security, and it is not to be judged, or should not be judged, by the number of days of imports that it contains. So I think that's really, really important. Okay, let me go back now to this low carbon direction and innovation. So again, the time periods are unclear, et cetera, but the energy system transformation, what I would say is going to a low carbon energy system. There are two essential pieces. One is efficiency, demand management across the board, transportation, buildings, industry, and electricity. The electricity system has been going towards lower carbon, most recently because of the coal to gas substitution, and will continue, and in my view, must continue to go there. There are many tools. There's wind and solar, obviously, and wind, especially in Oklahoma, is obviously a big story. But as I'm sure most of you know, the costs of wind and solar have just fallen just dramatically over the last decade, and are becoming, in many situations at least, quite competitive even without subsidy. There's nuclear. The nuclear story isn't so great in the United States. The 4 reactors being built, new reactors in the southeast, are in deep trouble. Big cost overruns. We're talking about $10,000 a kilowatt capital costs in the end, maybe a slightly bit more. And this is a problem. I don't believe this should mean the end of nuclear power, but practically speaking, it's hard to see any American utility making those kinds of investments, at least for a long time, with that performance. So I'm just going to say, I think, I may be Pollyannish, but I hold out hopes for what are called small modular reactors. There's one right now of 50 megawatts in the licensing procedure. These could change the equation in terms of the kinds of financial engineering required to build a plant. And if we could get enough orders, we could build a factory, roll them off a production line, good quality assurance, good workforce, and maybe nuclear can make a comeback. Carbon capture, sequestration, something where we've got to keep pushing. We need to innovate. In my view, we have had very little innovation on the costly carbon capture side, and I think that's something that we can do. And of course, natural gas, as I said, will have an extended role in going to this lower carbon future. So I think we've got a lot of options there, and it's very, very important. The other one I would mention, particularly in the nuclear, in the solar and wind context, is the need for storage. Once again, battery costs have come down also very dramatically, both for transportation and for stationary applications. But I want to emphasize we're not there, because even with that, what that does is addresses storage on, let's call it an hour time frame, maybe a few hours. It does not resolve the issue of storage on longer time frames. We need a lot of innovation and cost reduction to be able to manage that, and that would be very different for putting together the whole system. Now, having said that, about the electricity system going to low carbon, that then, of course, begs the question of how much more of the system can you electrify. In transportation, we clearly have light-duty vehicles that can be electrified, but that's not the whole transportation system. And then it gets hard. So I think we have to recognize that liquid fuels certainly are going to be with us. Maybe there'll be some alternatives like advanced biofuels, but we have a lot of innovation required in the transportation system. Industry, I think, is even harder to go in the deeply decarbonized pathway. Carbon capture and sequestration can help. In fact, maybe it's even more important in this context than for power plants. But these are all areas that are ripe for further innovation, and innovation here largely means, in the end, cost reduction in providing energy services. But finally, because there are all those challenges, I think we also need to be, this is now longer term, but we need to be innovating hard in what I call large-scale carbon management. Other ways of addressing this, and a holy grail which could use CO2 would be, in fact, this happens in the laboratory at small scale, CO2, sunlight, and water to a fossil fuel replacement. These are all ideas out there, and a big innovation agenda, as I said. I should have mentioned, by the way, in terms of CO2 utilization, today we do have a lot of CO2 being utilized for enhanced oil recovery. Mike and I were discussing that earlier today, and probably in Oklahoma it's known, in other parts of the country it's not known very well, that we are producing 300,000 barrels a day of oil from CO2 flooding. That CO2 is mainly natural CO2. It's kind of running out. And if we want to ramp that up by maybe a factor of 10, we're going to need the CO2 from power plants or industries, et cetera, to be able to get that up to a major resource. Okay, I think I'm probably going on too long. So let me wrap up with a comment on business innovation. So technology innovation is critical, but business innovation is critical. And that's across the board. I noted earlier to one of our colleagues that I've quoted the Shell CEO as saying, I produce dollars, not barrels. So the idea that, look, it's about providing services, energy services, in whatever the ambient requirements are, and companies knowing rules of the road, I think, have lots of time and ability to innovate and to do well as the energy system evolves. But let me say that I think the electricity system is one that is particularly ripe for new business models because there's kind of a slow motion train wreck in a certain sense. On the one hand, you have a lack of demand growth. Then you have the introduction of dramatically increasing wind and solar. You have distributed generation coming on. These are all challenging the conventional utility business models. And then when you go, and so if you're a business in that situation, the pie's not growing, you're getting squeezed by new competitors, you've got your customers producing their own energy and wanting you to buy it back, that what you might think about is, well, I better get some new services. Like, how about all those smart things behind the meter, the Internet of Things? Great business. The same one that the big data companies are eyeing. So I think there's going to be a very interesting development here, and the regulatory system will do a lot to shape how that kind of development can go. But this is a great thing. I said this morning for the students, this is a great area for thinking through novel business models where you've got to think beyond electricity per se, but all the things that you can deliver to customers, particularly behind the meter. So I think innovation, again, in all forms is called for. Innovation in technology, innovation in business models, and maybe just to end, innovation in policy as well. And here, I don't know, it's hard to know exactly when, if and when we will see at the federal level policy in this low carbon direction. But in terms of innovation, I would point out, I'm sure some of you certainly have heard, but the so-called conservatives approach, George Shultz, Jim Baker, one of the Waltons, et cetera, and what they've said is, look, we should start to put a price on carbon emissions, take the money, send it back to everybody, give them a check, divided evenly, and to do that at the same time of removing appropriately some regulations and some financial incentives. Make the system a lot simpler and go in this direction. So there's a lot happening at the national level. There's a lot happening at the company level. There are challenges, but this is what makes the business, in my view, kind of fun and interesting. I think we will see a big transformation, and I think the United States can really do well at this as long as we maintain our lead as innovators. Thank you. Oh, you're off the record. What about me? That's the question. All right.
I'm curious what your thoughts are on national energy policy and or the Energy Policy Act, the need for a national energy policy to be informed by science and technology research and development for these technologies that haven't been developed yet into a national energy policy?
Actually, this part could even be on the record, the next part, but no, let's keep it simple. No, I think the answer, or at least the best answer I can think about, is frankly what we started to do in the last few years, and Melanie Kenderdine's office was the point of the spear on this, and which I hope gets continued. Specifically, we took on so this is going to get a little bit inside baseball, but you asked to make a policy, and I don't think policies are made well like in the shower in the morning. I mean, you know, I think it takes like real analysis. So we start, sorry, I'll take the shower. I withdraw the shower comment. The question was, how can you put together an energy policy that actually gets bipartisan support and is analytically grounded and can move forward? So that's when we started what's called the Quadrennial Energy Review process. 2 volumes were published. There should be 2 more to come, I hope. So what we did is we took a particular area for the first one, energy infrastructure, wires, pipes, inland waterways, you name it. And it's hard to believe. There were 22 federal agencies involved. And we knew the pain we were taking by doing that. But our view was, what comes out the other end will never get through if you haven't gotten the administration on board and if you haven't got Congress on board. So we did that, lots and lots of analysis, huge amount of analysis, all kinds of papers published, pulled together recommendations. And I would offer at least one factoid to support the merit of doing this. 21, right? 21, I think. 21 recommendations of that first report were, or at least partially or fully, put into law, not passed a committee vote and then you declare victory and it vanishes. Passed into law. That included a $2 billion authorization for rebuilding the petroleum reserve, which is now going on. And by the way, that's as a little aside, and that story is very interesting. Part of rebuilding the petroleum reserve was just that it hadn't been, frankly, properly modernized and maintained for years. But the other part was, because of the change of the oil business in the United States and different flows, it was no longer flows from the Gulf of Mexico north only, but it flows to the Gulf of Mexico, that the distribution system needed more maritime capacity. So part of that $2 billion is to build that maritime capacity. So that's just an example, but it gives you a flavor. You could really get business done by going through the hard work of bringing all these voices together, lots of external meetings, stakeholder meetings all over the country and in Canada, and a call to Mexico. And then in a time of tremendous partisan division, we got 21 recommendations put through. So I think that's the way you got to do it. It's hard work. It takes active management from the top to kind of get it done. But I think we can do it. I think we have a demonstration that it can be done, even in these times.
Steve?
Secretary, how do we get past this not in my backyard problem we have in our country? We talk about infrastructure security. We have this attitude of, I don't want the pipelines, I don't want those high voltage wires in my backyard. How do we get past that conversation?
I'm sorry. The question was, how do we get past not in my backyard for energy infrastructure? And I got to say that's not. I don't know, because when all is said and done, I do still prefer democracy, and once again, I think it's going to be. There's no magic bullet. That's going to be kind of one by one. I'll give you just my own example, and I won't show the scars, but something that involves Oklahoma. It was the so-called Clean Line Transmission Project, electric transmission project to get Oklahoma wind into the southeast. I can say, and again, it's off the record, that, Arkansas was not thrilled. And it turns out that Congress had passed a law that had never been used that effectively allowed the Department of Energy, through particular power marketing administrations, if need be, to take eminent domain. Not something that was lightly to be taken lightly. So what we did instead is, and it took 2 years. We worked with the developers, we worked with the state, we got lots of things put in for Arkansas, dropping Oklahoma wind in Arkansas if they wanted it, taking Arkansas renewables out of the state if they wanted it, frankly, local sourcing, supply chain purchases in Arkansas. So, it took a lot. We got it done. Of course, it's in court at the moment. But I think that it just got to be that kind of. In the end, it's always about hard work and somebody willing to put in the work and working it through. No magic answer.
All right, so the simple question here is, what lessons can be learned from Germany's energy wind program, keeping in mind two central elements, the first being that the more energy efficient society becomes, the more energy we actually use, the example there being the computer processor. Secondarily, no civilization in history has adopted a less energy-dense fuel as its baseline. So why do we not hear more about a hydrogen economy and focus our efforts toward it? And why do we spend so much time on less energy-dense fuels, particularly in the United States, centered around wind and solar?
Well, there were several questions in there, I think. But certainly in regard to Germany, we know that they obviously have some challenges, and prices, for one thing, are high in the way they went about it. And I think, by the way, I do think that they will carry through on the elimination of nuclear power. And this time, I think it will be real. But what I want to also emphasize in terms of lessons learned is Germany does have as do some other North European countries, they have a big advantage. It's called Scandinavia as a battery because of the hydropower, right? They've got an enormous hydropower resource, and hydropower is pretty fabulous for balancing all these loads, et cetera. As far as hydrogen goes, well, I mean, again, there's cost reduction issues, but I think that hydrogen could end up being quite interesting, in fact. And of course, it can be made from natural gas most cheaply today. Electrolysis is trying to get the cost down. But you hear about hydrogen for vehicles a lot, for fuel cell vehicles. I don't know, that's a tough one, because the infrastructure for hydrogen refueling just of vehicles can be pretty challenging compared to electricity. And of course, the range anxiety that fuel cells are supposed to overcome is going down because of the increased range or lower cost of battery. So that's a difficult interplay. However, I said earlier that if you're looking at cleaner processes in industry, there's a bunch of stuff that I just don't see electricity replacing. High process heat, high temperature process heat, et cetera, et cetera. that may be a place where hydrogen looks interesting. And if hydrogen starts serving those needs, maybe then a much bigger hydrogen infrastructure could get built, which maybe then also services the vehicle fleet. So I think that's still an interesting dynamic, with a long way to go. Yeah, interesting.
One of the greatest challenges facing mankind is probably water. And I was curious what your thoughts are on the time frame for perhaps solar bringing costs down to a point where every part of the world can desalinize seawater.
Well, obviously, desal is growing quite dramatically in many places, and we may be seeing a lot more of it in the United States as well in certain places. But I think I think what's interesting in the solar is probably the hybrid systems, where the solar, and it could be solar thermal, is both doing desal and providing power in ways that are being called upon. So it's kind of a sharing, and I think there's quite a bit of work going on in there. Again, a lot of innovation going on there. It will help to get more efficient desal processes to have that happen. And there are some pretty wild ideas in terms of fancy membranes and the like, which are nano engineered. But we'll see. The costs have to stay reasonable. So I don't know. Yeah.
My question is more along the lines of advocacy. Just today, 3 American physicists won the Nobel Prize for measuring,
My friends.
yes, things that none of us can see. None of us can feel, none of us can even mostly comprehend. But most of us go, wow, that's really awesome that they won this. This is really cool. When we start talking about things like climate change, people are like, oh no, that's not true. That can't happen. That's not what's going on. How do we bridge that gap between things that are so theoretical and things that are so concrete? Not to put you on the spot.
No, well, look, I think personally on the climate discussion, I don't think we have been very we collectively have not been very articulate about it, particularly on some of the simplicity, some of which I tried to capture earlier in terms of the global warming issues, et cetera. Look, it's ultimately that's a big transformation that we're talking about. Where do I want to go with this? I think that we have not been able to project the idea, basically, of risk management. That's fundamentally what it is. The scientific community is clearly overwhelmingly saying what the effects are, and much simpler arguments that are used often can be used to provide completely adequate arguments for the need for prudent action. And again, in a risk management, or sometimes it's said an insurance kind of thing. If your corporate risk officer says, let's keep doing what we're doing because there's a 3% chance it won't turn out badly, that person is not in the job very long. But we've got a bunch of people I could name a particular place farther east that don't seem to have job insecurity for not actually being sensible risk managers. And there's a lot of stuff that you can do that is, no regrets, prudent, et cetera. How hard we push, how fast we push, I think nature will help determine that. And the tolerance for adaptation and spending a lot of money on adaptation will also determine that. So I think, it's going to be a dynamic process. And it's more the mindset that we need that, look, we got to do serious risk management here and start moving in this direction. But I don't know. By the way, if I can, may I continue with LIGO? Because I'll even tie it back to somebody who might be in this room, I'm not sure. The initial reference, sorry, but this is going to be now your physics lecture. The initial reference was to the Nobel Prize in Physics, the Gravitational Wave Observatory. Totally amazing. To tell you how amazing it is, there are two observatories, one in Louisiana, one in Washington State. They are L-shaped. They're each leg, I think it's 2 kilometers, or is it 4 kilometers? I think it's 2 kilometers, I forget. 2 or 4 kilometers each leg. You have lasers, you have mirrors. When all is said and done, the measurement that they made is of the displacement of a mirror by 1/100th the radius of a proton. Exactly right. And now, I'll tie it back to the oil industry. In, 1992 or something like that, I don't know, I was head of the Department of Physics at MIT, and we had companies come in. I would invite companies in to spend a day with us. They're researchers, seeing if there were collaboration possibilities. And I always remember one of company. I'm getting this off the record. I'm sorry. I'm going to name you. Schlumberger came in, and I put on their schedule the Gravitational Wave Laboratory, LIGO. One of the guys who won the Nobel Prize was the head of that laboratory. And of course, Schlumberger did everything they could to get out of what the hell do we want to go to a gravitational wave laboratory for, right? You could see the prearranged phone calls that would come. Oops, got to go back to the office, right? Sorry. Oops. Anyway, they went. The only person in that day's visit they invited back to the laboratories was the guy who got the Nobel Prize, Ray Weiss. The reason was they didn't understand. The reason I wanted to go there is if you're going to measure that kind of a displacement, think about the seismic isolation you need. Very interesting to Schlumberger. So it's the technology that had to be developed to make a measurement that you cannot believe is possible, but they did it. So it's very interesting. All these connections will come from basic science doing that. Actually, as another aside, atomic clocks were invented to prove Einstein's general theory of relativity. So these very basic experiments that we've got to support, they're pushing the technology, and they spill back into all kinds of practical applications. So, sorry, it was an aside. You going to have dinner?
One more, this will be it.
Okay.
Could you talk about your experience as Energy Secretary? How did you become Energy Secretary? Did you find the government service worthwhile?
So the question was, the question was, roughly speaking, what was it like to be Energy Secretary, and was it worth it? Right? All right. It's not for everybody. No, it was great. It was wonderful, and I got a sense of accomplishment. I already mentioned that quadrennial energy review. Getting all these things in energy policy approved was really great. But, you know, I'd just say that, look, I mean, basically, I was there in the second term of President Obama. The fact is that 2 of his high priorities were nuclear security, which again, most people don't know the Secretary of Energy has enormous responsibility for. The Iran deal was one element of that, and the clean energy, innovation, climate agenda. So, you know, pretty good time to be there and to be, you know, right in the middle of the action. So it was very, very rewarding. It was critical that, you know, look, I'll be honest. If those of you who are thinking about auditioning, let me tell you, it's good to have a practice run. So I was undersecretary in the second Clinton term, and it really helps because I knew how the levers worked. I knew people. I could bring in very, very talented staff, people on day one. I knew how to plug them in, et cetera. So so the experience was extremely helpful. But boy, it was very, very, very rewarding indeed. And, you know, we felt we got things done, and that's all you can ask for in those jobs, is to get stuff done. So. And by the way, let me just add one other thing. And the other thing, though, and this is again in the off the record thing, but maybe it was part of the experience, maybe it's personality, maybe it's whatever, but I think our department was distinguished in its ability to work across the aisle. And you could never get anything done without that. And just like some of the other stuff I was talking about, it's also hard work. I mean, it's not calling up somebody when you need something, right? It's all about relationships, whether it's with the Congress or whether it's international. And so, you know, if you don't like kind of that part of the business, you're probably not going to do a very good job, I think. Anyway, with that, thank you very much.
I think this demonstrates the value of science, of facts, of data analytics, of really doing hardcore research, because when you see people like Dr. Moniz, like Mike Ming, I tell my students every time Mike comes into my class, he's a walking encyclopedia about energy. Well, I think we saw the entire documentation of the encyclopedia here tonight. So please join me again in thanking Dr. Ernie Moniz.